Thank you, Chair Macbeth. My name is Russell Denow Schroeder. I'm a planner in CPHD Housing Division, and here to introduce the needs analysis. Every 5 years, we produce a housing needs analysis to monitor the changing demographics in our community and to quantify the housing need through market analysis. This is important information so that we can continue our work towards achieving our goals of a sufficient supply of housing that corresponds to the needs of the community and to enable access to housing for all segments of the population. So the needs analysis was prepared by Dr. Keith Waters, Assistant Director of the Center for Regional Analysis, and the Stephen Fuller Institute for Research on the Washington Region's Economic Future at George Mason University. Dr. Waters is with us tonight to share his findings, and take it away, Dr. Waters.
Thank you, Russell. I will share my screen. I'll share this one. And hopefully, I gotta move this. Let's see, when I go into presenter mode, are you seeing the full screen over here?
That looks good.
All right. Turn on a laser pointer here. Thank you, Russell. So I'm Keith Waters. I'm the Assistant Director of the CRA and Fuller Institute at George Mason. I'm actually sitting in Arlington at the moment in the Clarendon campus of George Mason. As an overview for the presentation, I'll be going through demographic conditions and trends over the last 10 years or so. Broken into households and people, and then we'll move into a housing market analysis and housing needs, both current and future. And then towards the end, we'll talk about additional considerations. Before we get going, I got a few notes on data and one on other. So when I'm talking about the Metro Core, I'll be talking about, I am talking about Arlington, Alexandria, DC, Fairfax County, Fairfax City, Montgomery County up in Maryland, and the Prince George's as well. But there are instances where it's more appropriate to talk about the urban core, and this is Arlington, Alexandria, and DC. When I am discussing 2023 data, so anywhere it indicates 2023 data, just know that I'm actually talking about the ACS 5-year sample from 2019 to 2023. It just makes it a little less wordy. And this also applies to the 2013 and 2018 data. And the final note is that my light will go off in about a half an hour. So I may go personally dark, but I will still be here. Jumping into the demographics, conditions and trends, starting with Arlington is the Arlington population for the most part is younger than the Metro Core. Okay, so the Metro Core again is kind of that beltway, anything inside or touching the beltway. The Arlington population is younger than the Metro Core, and that's most apparent in the age bracket from 20 to 29 years of age. 19.5% of Arlington's population is 20 to 29 years old, whereas only 13.5% in the Metro Core is in their 20s. 18.7% of Arlington's population is in their 30s, compared to 15.4% in the Metro Core in their 30s. And this is basically accounted for on the ends of the age distribution. So Arlington tends to have a smaller share of its population under 19 years of age, and tends to have a younger or have a smaller share of its population in the older adult population, ages 50 all the way up to 80 plus. So in general, Arlington is younger than the Metro Core. However, that has been changing over the last 10 years. The number, so this is now level, not share, the number of people in Arlington in their 20s has declined a little bit, but it's stabilized over the last 2 5-year census samples. And what we've seen is actually an increase in the number of people in the older in all the older age brackets from 40 on up to 80 plus. And we've also seen actually, particularly in the 10 to 19, we've seen an increase in the population in the 10 to 19 cohort. What is somewhat interesting is actually this 30 to 39 age cohort, where we saw an increase from 2013 to 2018, and then it actually fell back down. Some speculation on why that may be the case is that during the pandemic, some of the folks who maybe wanted more space when they had kids decided to move elsewhere. When we're looking at the population by gender share, Arlington is more balanced between male and female than the Metro Core as a whole. It's effectively 50-50 within sampling error, whereas the Metro Core tends to skew more female. And this has been relatively stable over the past 10 years. Examining Arlington by race and ethnicity, the population in Arlington is far more likely to be white than the Metro Core as a whole, with 59.2% of Arlington's population accounted for by the white population, compared to only 36.7% of the Metro Core is white. And this is accounted for effectively in the other race and ethnicity categories, but most notably in the Black and African American population. Only 9.1% of Arlington's population is Black or African American, compared to 28.4% in the Metro Core as a whole. That being said, Arlington is slowly, or has been growing slowly, more diverse. The share of the population comprised of white declined from 63.6% in the 2013 sample to 59.2% in the 2023 sample. This is more or less, picked all, this population share is for the most part picked up amongst the other population or the other race and ethnicity categories. For example, the 2 or more category increased its population share from 2.3% to 5.0% over that period. That being said, this is not the result of the white population shrinking. It's just in the population of the other racial categories growing somewhat faster. The white population between 2013 and 2023 increased by about 3,300, whereas the Black population increased by 3,600. And this is off of a much smaller base, so this is growing its share relatively faster than the white population. If we look at population share with a disability, Arlington, compared to the Metro Core, has a lower share of its population with a disability. In the most recent data point, 6.8% of Arlington's population had a disability, compared with 9.4% in the Metro Core. But both Arlington and the Metro Core, the share of the population with a disability has been increasing over the last 10 years. So both of these are trending generally in the same direction. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide because I think it's pretty relevant to what's going on right now and something we'll talk about at the end. Focusing first on the green bars, what we see is that we were, prior to the Budget Control Act and sequester, if we can think back that far in 2011, we had net domestic in-migration, and then that actually quickly turned to net domestic out-migration as folks in the area decided that it was the relative economic opportunity here was worse than other places, and so people were leaving Arlington and the DC MSA as a whole. The same trend shows up. And Arlington was losing about 2,000 people a year. And we focus on domestic migrants just because they're a little more sensitive. They're a lot more sensitive to relative economic opportunity. And then the pandemic hit, and 7,200 folks left Arlington between 2020 and 2021. That has since way pared back, and we're effectively flat at the moment. The second thing that I'd like to point out is the yellow bars. If we look at international migration, what we saw prior to the previous Trump administration was net international in-migration of about 2,500 people per year. And following the previous Trump administration's order, this contracted to 1,200 or so folks per year. This has since expanded, most recently coming in just a little under 4,000. I very much anticipate that contraction that we saw in the previous Trump administration will be sharper and faster. So this is something to pay attention to moving forward, and puts a little bit of downward pressure likely on Arlington's population moving forward. Okay, so now let's go into the demographic. Let's look at households. Arlington has done a pretty good job actually of expanding the number of households, increasing the number of households within Arlington County, increasing from 94,000 or thereabouts in 2013 up to 111,000 by 2023, which is an 18.1% increase over that 10-year period. This is somewhat faster than the Metro Core as a whole, which increased from 1.49 million in 2013 to 1.67 million in 2023. So Arlington has grown a little bit faster than the Metro Core overall. But I'll point out that it increased a little bit. It increased faster between the 2013 and 2018 period than it did between the 2018 and 2023. And we can see that in the fact that Arlington increased its share of total households in the Metro Core from 6.3% to 6.8%. Right, so it made up a greater share of the Metro Core in 2018 than in 2013, and then that slipped just a little bit by 2023. So it was growing faster from this 2013 to 2018 period, but then slowed a little bit in the 2023 period. Looking at the share of households by renter and owner, what we see is that the share of households comprised of renter households is larger in Arlington than in the Metro Core, with 58.2% of households in Arlington County being renter households, and only 41.8% of households being owner households. And this is basically flips. These proportions basically flip when we look at the Metro Core. This is that Beltway, where 58.1% of households in the Metro Core are owner households, and 41.9% are renter households. This is one area where we definitely want to look at the urban core. And so what we see is Arlington is really similar, effectively identical to both DC and Alexandria, who have renter shares of their households at 58.9% and 57.2% respectively. So Arlington has a higher share of renter households than the Metro Core, and then a much broader MSA, which goes out really far into the exurban areas, but is really pretty similar to DC and Alexandria. Looking at the share of renter households over time, what we see is that Arlington has been increasing steadily. The share of renter households in Arlington has been increasing steadily over the last 10 years. It increased from 54.7% in 2013 up to 58.2% by 2023. So the share of renter households has been growing. And this is something that I would just kind of draw your attention to, and just kind of put in the back of your mind, because when we get to the forecasting bit, this does drive quite a bit of the other things that are going on, at least as far as the forecasts are concerned. So just the share of renter households has been increasing over the last 10 years is just kind of keep that in the back of your head. Switching to household incomes, the thing that I just want to point out is that Arlington is generally wealthier than the rest of the Metro Core, with 16.3% of its households making $300,000 or more. And if we look at the Metro Core overall, 13.2% of households make over 300,000. So Arlington has a greater share of households making actually over 100,000, 200,000, and 300,000 than the Metro Core. And then that, is made up at the other end of the income distribution with fewer or with smaller share a smaller share of its households making $100,000 or less. Looking at the share of households by family type, the one thing that I would really draw your attention to is so the blue bars are Arlington, and the point that I would just like to make is that Arlington, the share of households in Arlington by family type are generally skewed more towards non-family households and away from family households. So 36.7% of households in Arlington are married couple households. This is over 40% in the Metro Core and nearly 50% in the MSA. And then on the other side, what we see is it has a higher share of households accounted for by non-family households. So for example, 19.2% of households in Arlington are single males living alone, whereas that number is much closer to about 12, or, we'll call it 12% for the MSA. Okay, so the breakdown is more skewed towards non-family households than family households than in the broader region. That being said, if we just look at the number or the share of married households, what we see is actually the share of households accounted for by married married couple, married family households, that's been relatively stable. So married households were accounted for 37.0% of households in 2013, and that's effectively where it's at in 2023. The big difference has actually been an increase in other households not living alone. So these are non-family households with roommates, increased from 13.0% in 2023 to 15.3% in 2022. And where this is made up in percentage terms are single parent households, which declined from 9.5% in 2013 down to 7.5% in 2023. When we look at share of households by size, the sort of overwhelming majority of households in Arlington are comprised of one or two people, with 74.4% of households being comprised of one or two people in 2023, up a percentage point from the 2013 sample, and then obviously just on the upper end of that, 25.6% are comprised of three or more people. Moving into some of the affordability issues in Arlington, we'll do the next couple slides are going to go into AMI, which is area median income, and then we'll move into cost burden. I do have a tendency to butcher my language around AMI, so please bear with me. This is owner household by area median income share. The one thing that I'd really just draw your attention to in the owner households is that 83.3% of owner households make 80% of area median income or more. So the sort of vast majority of owner households are, pretty close or above area median income. That being said, 5.5% make less than 5%. 5.5% of owner households make less than 30% AMI. But looking at that 83.3%, that make 80% or more, when we compare owner households to renter households, it drops precipitously. Only 58.4% of renter households make 80% AMI or more, and so that's going to then imply that a much larger share of households are making less than 80% AMI. So 15.3% of households that rent make less than 30% AMI. This general notion that renter households have lower incomes is going to show up in a bunch of different ways, and we'll kind of break that apart. But generally speaking, the thing that kind of stick in your mind is that renter households, for the most part, have lower incomes. When we break that apart by race, what we see in the owner households, so this is owner households, what we see is that the share of households that are Black, Asian, or that are headed by a Black householder, an Asian householder, or a Hispanic householder are going to be higher. The share of those households are going to be higher than the share of white households not sure I said that exactly right, so I'll try one more time. The share of, we'll just stick with black for the moment, the share of black households making less than 30% AMI is going to be notably higher than the share of white households making less than 30% AMI. So 15.6% of black households that own their homes make less than 30, or I'm sorry, yeah, make less than 30% AMI, where it's about 4% for white households. Generally speaking, Black, Asian, and Hispanic households are going to be in these lower income brackets. When we look at renter share, that y-axis moves up quite a bit, with 28.9% of Black renter households making less than 30% AMI. So Asian, Black, and Hispanic households tend to make less money than their white counterparts, and this is true for both renter and owner, but a greater share make less than 30% AMI, or the other various lower AMI categories than their white counterparts. When we look, so now we've just looking at all households that make less than 60% AMI. But this chart basically stays the same regardless of what AMI categories you lump together. The point is that older adult households tend to actually, a larger share of older adult households make below 60% AMI than their younger counterparts. And that this is true both in owners and in renters, but it's going to be or a greater share of renter households make that below 60% AMI. This is where my words get all mumbled. So why don't we give a very explicit example? 82.3% of households headed by somebody 80 plus make less than 60% AMI compared to just 32.5%. Both of those increase through all age cohorts once you get past this kind of like prime age, 30 to 49. But generally speaking, older headed households make less money. This is the last AMI share by owner household that I can mince my words on. And the point that I want to make 2 points here. One, married households, whether they're owner or renter, a greater share of married households make over 150 AMI, 150% of AMI than female or male-headed households. So which is to say married households are more likely to make more money than their single-parent household counterparts. But two, female-headed households are more likely to make less than 30% AMI than their male counterparts. Okay, so 19.1% of female renter households make less than 30% AMI compared to about 14% of male renter households making that same less than 30% AMI. So in general, married couples make more and female couples are more likely to make less. Now, moving into cost burden, which is a little bit easier to go through, what we're going to see is basically a restatement of what we just saw with AMI. So I will go through it a little bit more quickly, but it's nice to show it both ways. As a refresher, cost burden is just where you are spending 30% or more of your household income on housing, and severely cost burden is you're spending more than 50% of your household income on housing. And what we see when we break that apart by race and ethnicity is again that Black, Asian, and Hispanic households are a larger share of Black, Asian, and Hispanic households are either cost burden or severely cost burden than their white counterparts. When we look at both of these charts, which have the same y-axis, what you'll notice is that renters are basically across all race and ethnic categories are more likely to be cost burden or severely cost burden than their owner counterparts. So renters, again, more cost burden. Asian, Black, and Hispanic more cost burdened than their white counterparts. Looking by age, what we see is, again, renters are going to be more cost burdened than owners at all age brackets. But what we see is that older renters and older owners tend to be more cost burdened than their younger counterparts. So older owners and renters, both more cost burdened, but renters are going to be far more cost burdened than their owner counterparts. All right, now when we're looking at cost burden by disability, what we see is that, again, so the two on the right are renters with no disability, and then those with a disability. Renters are, again, more likely to be cost burden than their owner counterparts, but those with a disability in either category are more likely to be cost burden or severely cost burdened than by their counterparts with no disability. Okay, which is just to say those with a disability are going to have higher housing cost burden. Okay, let's move into the next section. So the next section is going to be housing market analysis. There's a lot more of this in the paper, so I encourage you to go there. I've kind of skimped on this part just for time's sake. There goes my light. We'll try to, got it on the first try. The point that I'd like to make with this chart is that Arlington's for sale inventory is incredibly tight. Okay, and it has been for over a decade. There are about 430 units for sale at on, kind of like, you can think of like there are 430 things that you could look to buy on Zillow at the end of each month. And that is compared to a household population of about 111 households. So for 111,000 households, there are only 430 units that you could potentially buy at the end of each month. This is split roughly in half at the moment between condo and detached, but that trend hasn't necessarily held up over the last 10 years. What we saw in the wake of the pandemic was a big upswing in inventory, of relatively big upswing in the month's end inventory of condo units, and this is basically attributable to the fact that people living in condos, a lot of them got quite nervous about being very close to other people and decided to leave. Or if you had kids, maybe you wanted to move out and go find someplace with more space, maybe in the exurbs or another MSA. So we saw a big increase in condo inventory, but that contracted over the last few years. And recently we've seen an upswing in detached homes. And this is very likely attributable to the recent layoffs from the federal government affiliated with DOGE, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that being said, even with kind of this relatively large upswing in the inventory of detached homes, we're still basically back to where we were in 2018, which was already an incredibly tight market. So there is just very little to buy in Arlington is the overall, like just at any price point, there's just very few households that you can buy in Arlington. Arlington remains an incredibly desirable place to live. So, and just with general population growth, if you increase demand and hold supply constant or even contract it, Economics 101, what we see is that the median sales price has been increasing really pretty steadily over the last 10 years. We saw a little bit of a contraction in late 2022, and this is kind of this surge of condos coming into Arlington. But that being said, it didn't really fall that much. The median sales price of sold homes, and this is all homes in Arlington, I believe this was July, was 740,000. Okay, so Arlington is roughly on par with neighboring Fairfax and about $100,000 more expensive than Montgomery County north of the river. Very briefly, just talking about the number of multifamily units in Arlington, it's increased, what's the word that I want? Incredibly steady. We'll use that word for the moment, from a little over 35,000 units in 2000 up to about 65,000 units in 2025. What really, actually, this is maybe my favorite chart in this, my favorite chart in this whole report, is just the incredibly steadiness of the growth in Arlington. Arlington is urbanizing, and as it urbanizes, it tends to have more multifamily units, as all jurisdictions around the country do for the most part. And Arlington has done a really good job of finding places to grow. And being from Michigan, I can tell you what happens when you're not growing, you're shrinking. So for me, this is a really positive chart. All right. Now let's go into current and future housing needs, starting with current needs. The thing that I'll draw your attention to is the top line here. We're just going to focus on under 30% AMI, and this is by all household sizes. If you want to look by different sizes, those are broken out in the report. And for brevity, we're just going to clump them all together. But what we see is that in Arlington, there's a little under 10,000 households making less than 30% AMI at the various household sizes. There's only 1,680 units that are affordable to those households as defined by HUD. Okay, so what we have is we have a dearth of households. So we have 8,082 fewer units than we do have households. Stated another way, since I've now butchered it 2 times, there's a shortage of over 8,000 units to the households that are making less than 30% AMI. Stated very succinctly, Arlington does not have enough affordable housing for the households making under 30% AMI. At the next level, the shortage remains. There's 714 too few units for the number of households making between 30 and 49% AMI. The picture gets a little bit more nuanced, while in one sense this suggests that there's kind of an oversupply of these households. Keep in mind that those making over 100,000% or over 100% AMI are actually competing for this cheaper housing, whereas these people don't have the option to buy the more expensive housing. So the main takeaway is that there is a shortage of more than 8,000 units for households making less than 30% AMI. Moving into for sale housing units, this is a little bit trickier of an analysis to describe the needs for sale housing. But the main takeaway is that for sale housing, the majority of for sale housing is out of reach for the majority of the population living in Arlington. So this is the median household income by race and ethnicity. And then over here is the income needed for the median family or the median household type. And so while the white population has a median household income of 137,000, the median or the income needed for the median single family home in Arlington would be 332,000, which is to say over half of the white population is really kind of nowhere near affording the middle sales price for homes sold in Arlington. None of the racial groups or none of the median household incomes of any racial group can afford the median single family home. The median income for none of the racial groups can afford the income needed for a median townhome. Only other 2 or more and white, the median household can afford the median condo in Arlington, whereas Asian, Black, and Hispanic, the median household income is too low to afford the median condo. So this goes back to this notion that we talked about earlier of these tend to be in lower AMI categories. They tend to be more cost burden. And this is just, again, another restatement that these three race and ethnic categories, for the most part, can't afford the median for sale in Arlington. All right, let's look at some of the future housing needs, and then we'll move on to current economic developments. And then we'll summarize, hopefully in the next just couple minutes. Quite a bit ago, I told you that the share of renter households is growing slightly faster than the share of owner households. And this drives much of the future housing needs. So Arlington worked with the Council of Governments to forecast the number of households out to 2050. And then this is just breaking out those households by, effectively recent growth patterns with renter and owner split, non-family, family split, kind of, I would say, being the largest contributors to where things shake out. But the broadest point is that there's going to be slightly faster growth in renter households than owner households. That is going to drive a little bit faster growth in smaller households as compared to larger households. The renter owner share growth rates are going to drive a little bit faster growth in non-family households as compared to family, and just a little bit faster growth in the lower AMI categories as opposed to the upper AMI categories. And then actually, called a noticeably higher growth in younger populations as compared to the older adult population. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to talk about some additional considerations regarding the current economic developments. This is something that we all read about in the news, and it is showing up in the data very clearly. The number of federal employees in the DC region has declined from 380,000 in December of 2024 down to 353,000 in the most recent data. Which would be August, and unfortunately, the September numbers are unlikely to be released in the coming weeks. But the main takeaway is that we've lost almost 30,000 federal workers just in the past 8 months, and we're now back to about the same level that we were in, I believe, March of 2009. So the federal workers that we have now is roughly equivalent to what we had in the spring of 2009. This is likely going to continue to drop as the workers who took the known colloquially as the fork in the road are removed. They've already been removed from payroll, but we won't know about how many got removed from payroll until November. And that also assumes that the BLS is able to is able to count those people, given the fact that they're currently not working. That is in addition to, this is, my general proxy for what I would consider federal contractors. This is the professional, scientific, and technical employment in the DC region. This has actually been declining for over 2 years. It hit a peak of 568,000 at the beginning of 2023 and is now at 546,000. So this has been declining, and this number will likely continue to decline over the coming year or so, given the federal cutbacks. So both direct federal employment and indirect federal contracting has been contracting for the last little bit here, depending on which one you're looking at. We are seeing an increase in the unemployment rate. It had been increasing already. It increased from 2% in spring of 2023 to about 2.7% at the change of the administration this year, and the rate of that increase is picked up, and we're now at 4%. In addition to the unemployment rate increasing, the labor force has been contracting. So these folks, this means the number of people in the labor force has actually shrunk. And when somebody leaves the labor force, they're actually not included in that unemployment rate. So there's actually fewer workers in the region than there were, than at the outset of the year. So in addition to the unemployment rate, a good number of folks have either dropped out or left the region's workforce. So summary, we'll do selected highlights. Go all the way back to the beginning. Arlington's population is younger than the metro core, although it has been increasing over the past decade. The population is growing more diverse, but this is a result of faster growth in non-white population. The households have continued to shift towards renters. Arlington has notably higher incomes than the metro core, with a median household income of $142,000 compared to $122,000. There are fewer people in the households in Arlington than the metro core. So 40.6% of Arlington households had one person compared to 32.2% than the metro core. For sale housing price increases slowed in 2025. Rent increases have been pretty stable. Actually, after some pandemic swings, we're basically back towards general inflation. But that being said, renters are more likely to be in lower AMI categories. Renters are more likely to be cost burdened than their owner counterparts. Black and African American, as well as Hispanic, and then Asian households are also likely to be in lower AMI categories and more likely to be cost burdened. When we look at housing affordability and rental units, we see a pretty significant shortage in the lowest AMI category, with 8,082 fewer units affordable for those making less than 30% AMI than would be demanded by current households. For sale housing is out of reach for the majority of the population. Future demand is largely driven by the growth in the renter share of households. And the one big caveat to the forecast that I provided to you is that there is a rapidly changing economic landscape that introduces notable uncertainty into those forecasts, with federal employment down 7% since December and professional, scientific, and technical down 4.4% since July 2023. So with that, thank you so much. You can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. But I will stop sharing. Actually, maybe I did just stop sharing. I meant to just actually shrink this. I don't know where you all went. I can reshare again, but I wanted to open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. That was a lot of data, but I think it's helpful to know what the landscape is looking.
Is it just me that can't hear him?
Erratic.
I think
No,
it's frozen.
Callan,
Can you hear
you
me?
broke up. Yeah, there you go. Now you're good.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I guess if you missed the first part, I just said thank you, and it was interesting information. My question is around supply. So I know the graph is trending, like we've been increasing the total supply pretty steadily since I think 2000.
Mm-hmm.
But I was curious, just in the last couple of years, I know construction costs have gone up. We've seen interest rates go up. Have we seen any changes? Just even if they're not that significant when it comes to supply of like condos or multifamily developments, like since probably 2020?
I can share the screen. So in the number of units, the answer is no. So in the growth of units, the answer is no, or not really. But in a more nuanced answer, I don't know if I included it or not. No, I did not. And I don't think I looked. I could look in the future. I mean, you could reach out to me afterwards and I can look. We have seen in other neighboring jurisdiction that construction starts have really pared back. So we wouldn't really see the number, we wouldn't see the growth in the multifamily slow down. What we would see basically, because those units had been started a while ago and coming online now, what we'd see is a really big slowdown in construction starts. We have seen that in other jurisdictions. I can pull those numbers for you later, but we have seen that other places. Arlington, I would assume, and this is pure assumption without having looked at the data, we probably would have seen a similar slowdown, but maybe not to the magnitude of some jurisdictions around here.
But yeah, if you're able to provide that information as a follow-up, it'd be super helpful.
Yeah. Could you send me an email and I can give you a
Yes.
more nuanced answer?
Yep. Other questions from commissioners?
Yeah, just similar to Kellen's question. Do you know if there are any jurisdictions in the DC metro area that have actually done a good job of increasing supply enough to like improve affordability, or at least kind of keep affordability the same across the years?
That is a tricky answer. I mean, for me, that Arlington, Arlington has done a great job, and I'm not pandering to the crowd. There actually is, I don't remember where I saw it, and it was a couple years. There's a pretty long form, kind of news article. It's like a blog post. I want to say it could have been Greater Washington, that argued that Arlington's growth of multifamily actually has held rent more stable for the broader region. The nuance, so I would say that Arlington has done in my mind, a quite actually really good job considering the fact that it is truly landlocked. Whereas when we think about like Montgomery County has the agricultural reserve, which is effectively a growth boundary. And so that really limits the housing that can be built. And Arlington has not done as good of Montgomery County has not done as done of a good job backfilling. So you guys are truly landlocked. So Arlington, DC has done a relatively good job. But that being said, it is a regional problem. We live in a labor shed. People commute all over the place. So every jurisdiction kind of needs to build ensemble to hold housing costs, to slow housing cost growth, right? Even as we build more housing, we don't really, it's not going to be the case that your housing costs are going to fall, but it slows down as rent increases. So the nuanced answer is the region as a whole has not done a great job building enough housing to housing price growth. But if I had to pick a jurisdiction that's done a pretty good job, it actually is Arlington, and as well as the district.
Good to know. Thanks.
Jason?
Hi, Dr. Wowers. Just a couple things, and I'm also answering Katie's question. I think three actually jurisdictions that I think have done a great job. Two in the New York City region that have actually dropped rents, despite regional rents increasing, especially in Manhattan, is New Rochelle and Jersey City, which on absolute terms this past year dropped rents because they've had so much supply. And then looking at DC region, one of the things Arlington, I think, I know you're fairly positive on Arlington, but I have a little more, I just want to note a couple of things in addition to what you presented, that, our young adult population ages 25 to 34, we're still below 2013 levels, despite where we've been at. And, comparing to our neighbors, for example, Falls Church, they've increased by 30%. I don't know that we've had a more of a head start. It's a little easier for them because they haven't been growing, but Arlington's at least better than say Tacoma Park, which has built nothing, and they've lost 40%. A complete, what I perceive as like, I mean, that's a demographic collapse. But then, and also, I love how seeing, your housing needs, and just noting too, the CPHD has the neighborhood by civic association. I know, the average single family home that you have is like $320,000 to get in. But we have neighborhoods in North Arlington that from the CPHD, it shows like Bellevue Forest and Gulf Branch, average incomes are nearly 500K, and it's showing in people can't afford to live there. We have schools. Our four Northwest schools are at program capacity. Discovery, Tuckahoe, Jamestown, and Nottingham are 82, 69, 68, and 63% program capacity by the end of the decade. So essentially, we're funding. These are public schools that they're private because we're essentially giving people who can afford to, with incomes of 500K and above, essentially privatized schools that are like 2/3 empty. And another thing I noted too is I know we talk about the need for families and whatnot, but I think there's such a big mismatch in housing because 75% of the households are 1 and 2 households, and I think there's obviously a lot of younger people that are here for the economic opportunity, trying to get those jobs in the core, and they don't want to live hours on out. But I think there's also a lot of older people aging in place that are living perhaps 1 or 2 households that are in a 3, 4, perhaps even 5 better, or they're living in more bedrooms than people, and perhaps they're in older housing stock. And I think there's the big question of, obviously we're not going to say, hey, we're going to kick you out of your home, whatever, to go to a studio or 1 bedroom if you're like a 1-person senior, aging. But it's like, I think there's a lot of different things that obviously we need to make it so we are balanced approach, and so that it's just sad to see like Arlington. Why are we have our young pop? It's such a great place for young. It's a great place for everyone, but of course, seeing when we're not growing, it's just incredibly frustrating because it's like it goes against a lot of narratives that we see, that like it's a bunch of like young people. Like, no, like Arlington we are not not even close to where we were opportunity wise compared to decades ago, even though we're just steady. So I think a lot of things, but I just wanted to, thank you for your analysis. But I just wanted to really highlight these, almost jaw-dropping things that it shows. I think just, it's just, I think
I'll come back and address some of them, but I do, just out of interest of time, Zach, did you want to go next? And I'll come back and address some of the things that you mentioned.
Sure. I don't think my questions will take too much time. Thanks again. That was a really, really interesting presentation. My question has to do with the individuals, under 50, 40, 30 AMI who are owners. Are those people generally folks who've lived in Arlington for 30 years and have owned their property since it cost them much less than it costs now? Or are some of those folks younger folks? And part of the reason I'm asking is because there's this increasing phenomenon across the country of younger folks who may not earn AMI or may earn, under 80 AMI who own because their parents are helping them. And I'm curious to understand if that's a phenomenon in Arlington. I don't know if the data is granular enough to be able to suss that out, but I thought I'd ask.
So let me scroll up here. The short answer is you could theoretically break that down, but we did not. So you're asking, oh no, this is renter burden. It's in a lot of ways the same. So when we're looking at AMI by owner, renter, I don't know where it is. Anyway, the short answer is I did not look at that, largely because policy tends to focus on the AMI of renters, because this is really kind of where policy has tools to impact stuff. But keep in mind that AMI doesn't take into account housing costs of owners. So it's just how much do you make relative. Well, I guess on the one end it does. When you're looking at owners who make less than 30% AMI, you're just saying, okay, does this owner make more or less than the area median income? That's okay. This is the answer that I want to give. when you're looking at area median income, it doesn't matter whether you own or it doesn't matter how long you've lived in your house or what even the mortgage payment on your house is, because what you're just saying is I make, if just for simplicity's sake, I make $40,000 and area median income is $100,000. Well, you just, it's not quite that simple because it's by household size. But basically, your mortgage payment really isn't gonna impact that, or how much you paid for your house isn't going to come into the AMI calculation for owners. I think what I'm hearing you say though is, kind of the identification of people who bought their homes a long time ago. They've ridden up the value of that home, and so their mortgage payment has been effectively flat over this period. That would show up in cost burden. And we did not look at how long you've been in your home is the short answer. So if we look at cost burden, that'd be a clearer way of getting at that answer. And that is not something that we looked at. But I mean, that could, to give you an answer, and I'm shooting from the hip a little bit here, so don't fully quote me on this, is, it is the case that when you look at, what's the saying? Don't do math in public.
I haven't heard that one, but it sounds like a smart rule to follow.
It has been the case that the older population has been increasing over the last little bit here, and so it's a little bit of a jump, but where was it? Anyway, that could play into a little bit of the fact of why the population has aged a little bit, especially in the older adult populations. Is you bought a cheap home, you got a really, really great mortgage rate, and now you're not going to leave. Going back to something that Jason kind of had alluded to, it is the case that, you said, like, okay, maybe it's the case that the older adult population, it's one or two people living in a 4-bedroom home, and then it's like, to an extent, there's like a housing mismatch. The New York Times had a really good article a year or two ago about there is a bit of a mismatch where older adults tend to have a little bit more home than they probably need. But when we think about the current moment in time, it is also the case that a lot of the older adult population actually feels trapped to an extent in their home because they have such a low mortgage rate and their home value went up in such a dramatic fashion that even to downsize, it would cost them more, because they would have to sell this home and then move into a smaller house of similar price with a higher mortgage rate. So we've, to an extent, we've kind of worked our way into this really stagnant housing market, and it's for a whole host of reasons. So it's kind of touching on two things. I hope that satisfies to an extent. There's a lot of nuance to that makes the whole problem sort of wicked in all sorts of ways.
Another quick sort of comment / question, just something I noticed, is with household income. It's kind of interesting to me because, you count married people and then you count one-person households. And so, for example, my fiance and I live together in Arlington. When we get married next year, our household income will double, but nothing's changing, But now we're suddenly in this completely different income bracket. So it kind of looks like we're in a different situation than we are now. I wonder if you think about the household size at all with the household income.
So the house, you would just be slightly categorized different in the income statistics that I'd show. I will say that looking at renter households by AMI band, that actually does take into account household size, and that doesn't really that doesn't bother with how many, whether the fact that you're married or not. So getting married doesn't qualitatively change you in the AMI category. It shifts you, like, we'll call it qualitatively, where you would fall in like the married, non-married household, like the family, non-family split that I talked about a little bit.
So you're saying that area median income is based on household size?
Yes, it's based on household size and not how, not whether you're married or not.
Okay. Okay, I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Other questions from commissioners?
Did I bore you to tears?
No, I mean, I think this was helpful. I think it's one of those things that, it will inform a lot of work that we do in the future, but also take time to process and, take these nuggets of information and apply it to the various things that we're asked to, provide recommendations on.
Mhm.
I mean, I think in particular, the things that stood out for me, I already knew the 30% of AMI folks they lack the housing that would be affordable for them. And we've talked about that many times in the Housing Commission. But I thought the slide that showed in order to purchase a home by the different racial categories, what their median incomes were versus what the median home price, for the various types of units, townhomes, detached or condo, that one really stood out to me as well. So now I thought this was super helpful and really appreciate the breakdown of the data. And, we'll keep working to provide recommendations to address some of these challenges that we face as a community.
That sounds good. And just, I told this to the last crew. I'm here. I have nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. So if things pop up, feel free to reach out. I'm sitting here.